Thank you for tuning into this podcast for the Commons Social Change Library. My name is Isabella Todd. I'm an organiser in the climate movement and a research fellow with the Commons Library as part of their Movement Monitor project. Today I'll be talking with two incredible climate and worker justice campaigners, Dan Sherrell from the Australian Council of Trade Unions and Desiree Cai from the Tomorrow Movement, about working across the worker and climate justice movements to win an intersectional campaign. Despite many climate and environmental organisations mentioning climate justice in their work, only a few of those provide definitions to their supporters of what climate justice actually means. Even fewer have active climate justice campaigns that they're working on. In this critical decade where the world is facing what many people call the polycrisis, working intersectionally towards climate justice is key. Today we discuss how you can do this work, do it well, and win, using the case study of the Net Zero Authority campaign as a vehicle. I'll let Dan and Des introduce themselves and their role in this campaign.
I'm Dan Sherrell. I'm the Senior Advisor on Climate Energy at the Australian Council of Trade Unions. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Sydney on Gadigal country. So as the sort of point person in the peak body for labour unions on climate and energy, I was responsible for building the union movement's campaign, both our policy demand on a just transition authority, as we called it before the legislation was written, and our campaign plan to win that authority. And that was building on literally a decade of advocacy from union comrades that came before me. So I sort of was I was the closer, but certainly not the opener from the union movement's perspective.
I'm Des, Desiree Cai, the National Director at Tomorrow Movement. Use they, she pronouns, and I live and work on Wurundjeri land. And for us at Tomorrow Movement, I guess our role in working on this campaign was like one of many different voices from the community, obviously being the voice of young people who have a stake in the climate crisis in general, but also more specifically for this, like for young people in the regions affected by Net Zero Authority. Yeah, like making sure that that voice was heard and it was like really loud and clear that like the ambition for this thing and the stakes of like why it was needed and more than what is needed was really amplified. I guess that was our role.
I thought we'd start out with a bit of context setting. This is a campaign that was focused around climate justice, and the purpose of this podcast is to provide a resource of how to effectively work towards climate justice. So I thought we'd start off with if you could each share how Tomorrow Movement and the ACTU, respectively, define climate justice in their work.
I think, I can start. I think for Tomorrow Movement, we call ourselves an unstoppable movement of young people fighting for a society with good jobs, great public services, and a safe climate for all. And so inherently, I think we see like solving the climate crisis not just as a numbers game in terms of emissions reductions, but as something that really improves people's lives from the outset. So like from the lens of looking at economic injustice in this country, like that also needs to be part of the solution when we're talking about solutions for the climate crisis. But I guess in a more broader sense as well, climate justice recognizes the fact that the folks who contributed most towards this crisis and the folks who are gonna, I guess the worst consequences of the climate crisis are the ones who have contributed the least to it. And there are like historical wrongs to right. So in like all of our campaigning, like who are the most marginalized voices who are going to be left behind first? How do we make sure that those folks are always like being thought of first rather than last? Which I think is, maybe the dominant way of doing things.
It's funny. So the ACTU, I guess I should say first that we very rarely in the union movement use the phrase climate justice. I think we're talking about a similar concept, but it's just a semantic difference between movements and sort of where people come from, the cultures and communities they come out of, their lived experience. But some of the union language that's used really echoes what Des just shared, even our triennial Congress policy. So every 3 years, the entire Australian union movement gets together and decides on our guiding policy across the union movement on a variety of issues, including climate and energy. And the title of the policy ratified at our last Congress, which was just earlier this year, was a safe climate with good union jobs. And the other way of, the sort of more dire way of articulating that, I think a quote coined by our former president, Sharon Burrow, is there are no jobs on a dead planet. So, obviously, for the union movement, what the climate movement would call climate justice looks like building an economy that doesn't destroy itself, which is the economy we have right now, and building an economy that doesn't destroy people, which is in many ways the economy we have now. It's extractive of labor, just like it's extractive of fossil fuels. So, I think climate justice would look like a fully renewable economy, but not necessarily in the degrowth model, in the model where, like, for the next few decades, we're building a lot of new infrastructure, whether it's wind turbines, solar panels, high-speed rail, seawalls, community batteries. Like, we're going to have to, this is an enormous public works project, basically, transitioning to net zero. And that means an enormous number of jobs. And so true climate justice for us means that those jobs are good union jobs, safe, secure, and well paid, so that in the process of transitioning to net zero, we are lowering the inequality gap rather than further widening it. And the way that you do that is strengthening the bargaining power of labor as opposed to capital. And, I think that's sort of like the hard brass tacks industrial relations version. The other version of that is like, lifting up all marginalized people who are victimized by the bosses. And that includes certainly First Nations people, and to a greater and greater degree, multicultural Australians, who are, a huge proportion of new union members, especially in the service sector, who too often occupy the bottom rungs of our economy. And, that's not fair. And the union movement exists to make fairness real.
Dan, you've kind of touched a little bit on this idea of like the sort of differences between movements, I think, in the climate and justice movement, the sort of context that I'm coming from. We talk a lot about the importance of building and holding relationships and trust in organizing and campaigning and in the movement more broadly. But I'm really keen to dig into what that looks like in reality. So how these relationships are formed and trust built, especially between workers and environmental activists where there has been animosity in the past. So in your experience, what was the beginning of the relationship between the ACTU and Tomorrow's Movement and other climate organizations in this work?
I don't know, Des, when did we first meet?
It must have been. Yeah, I think you first had a conversation with Kat, who was national director at the time, and I was Ames lead. And I remember, I think Kat had just met you. I don't even know where, some conference or something. And you'd started talking about this idea of like a net zero economy. I think it was called something different then, Energy Transition Authority or something like this. Yeah, in the way that we've worked together, like I think that there are always people within movements who see the value of folks doing different work, but different but aligned work. And so obviously the role of a youth climate justice movement is really different than the role of the minor union movement in winning, change, but we have this alignment in where we want to go. So I think that was like maybe the first time that, like, when we first worked together, I mean, I felt a real sense that, you were really bought into this project of like the whole progressive movement needs to get behind to work on these big issues, not just the union movement in a silo or the climate movement in a silo or young people in a silo.
Yeah, I was and am bought into that vision in a huge way. And, I think, to be honest, like, it often takes individuals who, as Des says, like, recognize the value in building bridges across difference. And, I think, not to toot our own horns, but, Des is a youth climate activist with a class analysis. I'm a union official who actually comes out of the climate movement in the United States in my roots. So I think there was like rich grounds for solidarity there, which I really am grateful for. And the people who understand what that bridge looks like have a role to play in making it safe to cross for the people in their constituencies that maybe don't have the perspective that would allow them to immediately see what this other movement, what this other community is really about. And it's too easy for people to, see a different social space, different semantic norms, different sartorial norms, People look different, they talk different, they might live in different places, and kind of like shut down and assume like that's just the other. And I think it's really important as progressives to undermine that instinct and to really foreground the enormous points of alignment and of shared interest. So I've tried to do that on my end. I would say there are definitely unions who, wouldn't themselves always feel comfortable sitting on the table with the Tomorrow Movement. But I think, the fact that the Tomorrow Movement really stepped up on the Net Zero Economy Authority and helped us campaign and has really, built some solidarity credit, I guess you could say, with some of our leadership. And, I think at the end of the day, like you have to work also with the people who are going to identify that center of the Venn diagram of shared interest and then campaign around it and leave the differences at the door. I think there's a certain style of campaigner who focus on the differences, but I think, the union movement in particular is very down. If we have something that we stand in solidarity on, like the rest can fall away, and we're gonna work on that together. And I think I personally think the center of that Venn diagram between our movements is really large.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are where there's an opportunity to step up in solidarity on a campaign and where the mutual interest is so aligned, like it just makes complete sense to do it. But I mean, within Tomorrow Movement as well, we teach our young leaders about this idea of political alignment. So the right are really united, right? Like the fossil fuel billionaires are in line with the Murdoch media, who are singing from the same song sheet as the conservative neoliberal sort of the folks who are pushing that sort of big business way of thinking about interest in the world. They're all in lockstep saying the same thing, and you need to build something that's more powerful and that's progressive and that's built in justice. And I think the union movement and climate movement are two key pillars of that new alignment in the left and between progressives that we need in order to win change at the scale and speed that we need to solve the climate crisis, but also all the other crises that we're collectively feeling the brunt of right now. And I think Dan's right in saying that it's also often it is just individuals who come to the table at the end of the day, individuals representing folks. And this may be a bit nerdy, but I had heard about this concept of critical yeast maybe a few years ago. The idea that, anyway, I don't know why it's called critical yeast, but if you get a group, a small group of people from really diverse backgrounds together in the same room to work on the same thing, really big things happen. I think that this is maybe a, looking historically at big moments of change that have happened, big wins for progressive that have happened throughout history. What's happened is that a bunch of folks who you don't think are normally aligned get in a room together and look at what their common interests are. So wherever there is more opportunity to build that new alignment and build our strength together, strengthening the union movement does strengthen the youth climate movement as well. They're one and the same.
Maybe it's called critical yeast because together we rise.
You've talked a lot about a strategic alignment, and Dan, you identified this sort of mutual ground that you had as individuals, and you talked about building a bridge. I'm really curious, how did you build that bridge? How did your organizations develop that trust with each other to do that work? It sounds like this work sort of started with an idea of a campaign. There was, not a pre-existing relationship. So how did you then, from that idea of a campaign, develop the trust to then complete that work?
I think I would say maybe part of the answer to this is like just to keep showing up. Like, I think maybe you started convening meetings about it, or we started saying, okay, let's chat about this. But, there's a lot of times you can say, let's chat on this shared campaign and it falls away. But like actually showing up to do the thing is like maybe step one.
Totally. Yeah, and we had put out a call around the Net Zero Economy Authority, and Tomorrow Movement had done some great work around a climate jobs guarantee, basically. And when you get down to the local level, like there are big overlaps between the two ideas in many ways. So yeah, Tomorrow Movement showed up when we put out that call, and Des themselves, and I think one or two comrades were present when we would do lobby days in the Capitol, and our president, Michelle O'Neill, clocked that, and I think also we've built on the collaboration since then. We both sit on the steering committee of this alliance, 70 some odd organization alliance called Renew Australia for All. And I think moving that up the chain was made easier by the fact that there were some familiar names on the steering committee, including Tomorrow Movement, that had stood with us previously on the Transition Authority. So it all kind of builds on itself. But yeah, I don't think it's that different than individuals becoming friends, institutions becoming friends. You just spend a little more time with each other, get used to each other's works, etc. And like the thing develops organically.
So I'm keen to talk about the campaign itself now and about how you worked together and developed that relationship that you just talked about through the course of the campaign. And yeah, any moments of maybe tension or moments of harmony. So you've already sort of touched on the inception of this campaign was like you put a call out. So at what point did you in the process did you start working on this campaign together, and what did that look like?
I mean, Tomorrow Movement, as I said, came with us to lobby days in Canberra. I think signed letters to the government about the Transition Authority. Did you guys appear at the inquiry on the NZEA
We
in the end?
did.
Yeah, so that
I
was
think
huge.
years, like a year or so after we first started working on this.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think where there were opportunities to jump in, we did some other stuff in our and like run a survey of like young people and collect their stories and try and bring like that voice, like that, I guess, diverse perspective into the campaign among like a bunch of other like really talented folk who were also working on the issue with us. Like I think the Next Economy comes to mind as one of the key folks who was really pushing this for a long time. And so it's Re-Alliance. And I think there were a few like collaborative Zoom calls where we were like, all right, what are the moments like some people are getting intel about this? Where are the points where we have to make submissions, or like when is the strategic time to like go on a lobby day, which obviously, Dan, you were like coordinating more of that kind of side of stuff. So I think it just started rolling and I was like, okay, what are the opportunities? I mean, we had thought about, as Tomorrow Movement, one of our strengths as a youth, a more like maybe Bolshe youth movement is like going and being a bit confrontational with the Labour government about like what they were doing. But we had discussions like, okay, maybe that's not the right time for this sort of a thing. So like making those sorts of calls as well. Like, okay, what's really useful for us to pitch in to this campaign, and what, based on what you're hearing from within meetings and stuff, that like a group like Tomorrow Movement, we wouldn't be able to get access to the Prime Minister or other cabinet ministers to ask about, like, where is the development of this policy, but we can like show up with the outside sort of stories and voice.
totally.
Sounds like it was, again, perhaps quite an organic process. Was there any initial sort of intentionality of how the work would be divided or how you would communicate across organizations?
I would say no. I mean, yeah, in the trenches, it's often always organic, and you're building the plane as you fly it, is in my experience.
Maybe one piece of that, although that was like really useful, was just like, there was always comms about what was happening, and where there was a moment that everyone needed to gather, I think Dan maybe played some of that convening role for everyone who needed to be in the room. And so that really built the collaborative like power of the group of organizations working on that together. I think the fact that we could just get in a room together and like finding the moments to be like, all right, like everything's happening, but like when do we have to talk about it?
What other organizations were involved in the campaign?
Uh, a lot to varying degrees. Obviously the unions who were representing the workers whose coal and gas plants were closing, so that Mining and Energy Union, the Australian Workers Union, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, and the Electrical Trade Union, as well as the Collieries and Staff Association. They were playing a really leading role from the labor side. And then we had a few climate environmental NGOs like Tomorrow Movement really play a hand in backing us in. Sunrise Movement was useful, as was ACF. And then, yeah, a lot of like work groups that did community work in some of these coal and gas towns, like Next Economy, like local community organizations from Collie to the Latrobe Valley. And then we were actually able to get most of the employers on side, or at least not opposing, because they fought us over the details of the legislation once push came to shove. But the general idea of an authority to make the transition in these regions orderly was like ultimately something they supported, because their bottom lines get hurt if it's like chaotic and unplanned. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think those were sort of the constituencies we had behind this for the most part.
So would it be like correct to say that the ACTU was sort of driving this campaign with yourself as the sort of convener, Dan, while the unions and other environmental nonprofits were sort of feeding in, sort of, I guess, as you identified as within the niche that made sense for the work that they were doing?
I think that's a fair characterization. But I would say it's myself and in close collaboration with those four unions that were sort of felt it to be our responsibility to win this policy.
I would really love to talk about how you win well in like climate justice campaigns. So I would love to know your reflections about, like learnings from this project, this campaign that you did, starting off with what worked well in this collaboration, in your opinion, especially if there are things you did or learned that you would take forward into future collaborations.
I think building buy-in with the big idea early, and then, to be honest, bringing your true friends in closer when the nitty-gritty was on the line, like in the Senate inquiry, is important. And then I think always a go-to, but assuming best intent when you're trying to build power across difference is like the only way you can do it. And then I think we're pretty good at celebrating this win, which is something that the left often isn't good at, especially because like the net zero economy authority is a little wonky. Like it's never going to be a front page headline in the Australian, certainly. But I think this could have been a very niche union only issue in the energy space. And I don't think it ended up being that. I think everybody kind of knows what the NZEA does now, even including the climate space, and why it's important and sort of how it functions. And I think that knowledge is only going to make the authority stronger and more accountable. So I think that's another, there's a learning piece to this whole thing that I think is important.
How did you celebrate that success as a collaboration of organizations?
Oh, as a collaboration of organizations, yeah, I guess mostly that took the form of emails, social media posts, and then beers in various locations. I think there was like a happy hour thing in Melbourne that I think it was at that bar near Trades Hall, and I think the call went out.
Do you have any reflections on learnings from that collaboration in terms of things that worked or went really well and things that you would take forward into your future work?
I think maybe to me, one of the things that was really great was like the open flow of information. And I think obviously that requires trust to happen. But like the fact that like whenever there was an update about where things were, we could trust that, it would be shared and then we could then move forward with the best knowledge that we had, like in those rooms where we came together on Zoom. Yeah, I think there was a lot that was shared between the different organizations having different meetings, and that just like let everyone to like collectively make better decisions about where to move forward.
Were there any points of tension in working together on this campaign, not necessarily between just your organizations, but other organizations in the campaign more broadly?
I would say in this campaign, there weren't, at least on our end, I don't know about you, Des, like significant points of tension. I mean, I think there's always, the elephant in the room in all of these sorts of collaborations is that, the union movement represents many workers, including fossil fuel workers, and the Tomorrow Movement is campaigning to end the fossil fuel industry for obvious reasons grounded in physics. And, that's a tough one, right? Because you're never going to get the mining union or the gas union to say that coal mining and gas exports should go away, at least not given the current makeup of the economy. But I think that there are two ways that can be seen. One is through the lens of solidarity, where it's actually young people want good jobs and a livable future too. They want the things that unionists in those unions currently are enjoying, and I think that's a grounds for empathy. And I also think there's a feeling that we have many common goals besides that, and certainly common enemies. And we can build, it is good to build on that foundation, rather than ignore it. And that also there's a kind of, at the end of the day, institutions represent, especially the unions, are democracies and represent a very specific member base. And so because they're democracies, have to respond to the material interests of that member base, or how that member base views its material interests. But I think there's a mature way of viewing institutional life where it's kind of the people who disagree with you aren't necessarily batshit and evil. They just represent a different perspective coming out of a different constituency, and you don't have to agree with it, but you treat it as that rather than some an unknowable, evil force.
Yeah, I think that thing about recognizing, I went to that parliament, one of those parliament lobbying days, and hung out all day with a worker at a coal mine, who was like, oh man, I'm worried about my future and my kids and stable jobs for my community. And I'm like, yeah, that's what we're worried about too, as young people, for our future. And your job's in coal, in a place, in a thing that can't exist anymore, right? But how do we make it so that that transition's really fair? And that's it's just so clear when you talk to people face to face that our interests are more aligned than they are disaligned. I don't know, we're just going back to that point where there's so much common interest.
Yeah, and getting in the room and humanizing people so that Sky News can't project us to each other as these crazy imbeciles.
In retrospect, what do you think was the hardest part of this campaign?
I would say the hardest part of the campaign actually came when we got after we got the commitment from the government, but then in shaping up the details of the legislation and making sure that the employers didn't just come in at the end and water everything down so that they didn't have to pay a dime. That took the most intense hours of my time and my legal team's time. So I think that was actually the point where I was oh my God, there's some risk that this could all be for naught. And we nipped that in the bud, but it took some doing.
Mm. Yeah, from my perspective, I think there was a lot of activity at one point at the very beginning, I think before we got the commitment. And it was really clear that we were running towards this thing. And then, then the doors close, and then behind those closed doors is all the negotiation about what does the policy look like. And for Tomorrow Movement, we're okay, all right, we'll see what happens. And obviously then folks Dan are back there, negotiating, doing all of that work. And so by the time that, it was the final Senate hearing, it had been like a really long time since our movement had talked about this issue because it had just like gone a bit quiet, which is, like kind of the reality of how policy is made when you're trying to win something. But yeah, like I think that's maybe just like a challenge on policy itself. And I mean, that's not the role that we play. So that's what I would say was hard for Tomorrow Movement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Made easier by the trusting relationship with the ACTU, knowing that your interests would be represented in those meetings?
Yeah, I think so. I think I was never worried that, Dan would sell something weaker. So yeah, I guess in some sense that is made easier.
Yeah, and we get to know people, like you kind of get a sense of their vibe and their values, like that's what trust is based on. It's not like dot points on a paper. It's just like, do we have common values?
Yeah.
And I've really felt, Jez, that we do.
Yeah.
And I've drawn on that.
Yeah, so trust exists between people, not between organizations, because organizations aren't really a thing, it's people.
Yeah, but and at the same time trying to, like, the ACTU, especially on the left under a labor government, is often the big fish in the room. And I try to treat that role with responsibility and some amount of grace and just be like a plain dealer as much as I can. And also try to use that role to like bring other folks up into power rather than like guard our treasure like a dragon.
So this campaign was successful, you won. What do you think was the power of this campaign that enabled it to win?
I feel like we've kind of covered that, to be honest.
I think maybe there's something about like that story at that point in time was really needed. Yeah, about the way that workers will not be sold out by the climate transition. Like I think that's such a key piece that like at that point in time for this win to come through has like paved the way to open up doors for like a different way that the climate conversation can happen going forward. But also like I think, yeah, a combination of bringing all those people in the room together to see those common interests, tell a new story.
The critical yeast.
In summary,
Yeah,
it's all about the yeast.
You said, yeah, we've sort of already covered that, Dan. Are you referring to, that strong overlap of interest between these movements and having, that strong common ground between the people who are driving the campaign?
Yeah, it's about identifying shared interests and building relationships and trust around those interests and taking action together.
So you've sort of already referenced future work and collaboration. What does that look like for your two organizations?
So our collaboration, I would say, has only deepened since this initial campaign, and we're on the steering committee together of this big alliance that I referenced. And we are currently campaigning publicly together, and Des stood alongside the ACT's president, Michelle O'Neill, in launching it in September in Canberra. Can't believe that was just September. A campaign to win a bunch of subsidies to support families, particularly low-income families and renters, to install solar panels, batteries, electric appliances, and do energy upgrades in their homes as a cost of living measure. And again, hitting that sweet spot where we're doing climate solutions work through a lens of class politics. Because as the famous unionist Chico Mendes once said, environmentalism without class politics is just gardening.
I think, I mean, it was really interesting reflecting on, this big collaborative alliance that we've worked on now, or we're currently working on together, because like part of the reason why we got to be in that room together with like a bunch of now other organizations who are also really core in steering this like new big alliance campaign. But like, part of the glue that made that possible had started because of the Net Zero Authority campaign and the work that we'd done previously. So I think now is the time for us to, I mean, always is the time, but now especially we really need to be running our campaigns in solidarity together and telling a bigger story that encompasses not just young people, not just climate, not just workers, and economic justice, but all of it together. I think that's what this like current time calls for. So there's only like going to be more need. for collaboration and building those relationships to move forward.
We talked about briefly, or I talked about, that trust is held by people, not by organizations necessarily. Do you think you'd be able to maintain these organizational relationships as, people move into other orgs or other roles in the future?
Yeah. I think there is a really important piece in making sure that, relationships are not just held through one person, but obviously there are like critical roles for like there are some individuals in the movement who are just really good at building and holding those relationships and really value that. But one of the hopes for this like campaign that we're working in Renew Australia for, like with the 70 plus organizations involved, is that it opens a way of working that like, we talked recently about like the need for this campaign, even if we were not campaigning about energy efficiency upgrades that'll save people money over like heat waves in summer. There'll be something else that this group of people needs to work on together. Like there's always going to be something else. And so building an alliance where people actively choose to work together, that's going to be needed for decades to come. So yeah, there's individuals, but like I think it is really important in our movement to build a culture where we are collaborating as like not just like as an add-on thing at the end, but as like one of the first things that we go to look for how we build our strength and power.
Do you have any other advice that you'd offer to groups and organizations that want to create alliances and collaborate towards true intersectional climate justice?
Mm. I think you do see a lot of collaborations in like the climate space, but that maybe are not as deep, or that just like are focused on one policy win and can't go further than that. And so I think Dan talked earlier about building relationship kind of being like building friendship, in this organic kind of a way. And I think it's true. Like if you like the people that you work with, it just makes it so much easier to do the work together and continue to collaborate. So I'd probably say like one of the most important things that I wouldn't discount is just the importance of relational time. It's often the first thing to go when we don't have time. It's like, no, okay, we'll just do a name round and that's all. But like really understanding each other and where you're coming from and the different places, but also the similar common values and common ground that binds people together, like building those relationships is a step that I would never skip. Yeah, I think that's like helped with the success of the current alliance we're working on, Renew Australia for All. And then that's just like maybe the key piece of advice I'd offer anyone else.
So there you have it. Critical yeast, sharing a beer together, keeping that justice lens on all of our work, never skipping the name round, but more importantly, putting in the work to hold genuine relationships. Thank you to Des and Dan for giving their time to this podcast. It was a true pleasure to talk to them both about their work, of which I am a fan. If you want to see more about their work, you can read more about the ACTU's climate work on the climate change section of their website, and make sure to check out the Tomorrow Movement on their website and on social media. You can also read more about the Net Zero Authority on the Australian Government website. At time of recording, there's some good information on the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet website, but hopefully there'll be much more soon. Thanks so much for listening to this podcast. Bye.